The window stayed open, even when nailed shut. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Drop a comment. Where are you listening from today? Your thoughts make this community extraordinary. Let's get started. The village of St. Mary Mead had, that Saturday, arranged itself into a picture of harmless festivity. In the vicarage garden, tables were set with pots of tea, currant scones, neat sandwiches, and little dishes of strawberry jam. The ladies of the Women's Institute, their hats trembling like stiff flowers in the autumn sunlight, moved between the tables, balancing trays and gossip with equal skill. It was the annual harvest fete, a modest affair by worldly standards, but for St. Mary Mead, the very height of the social calendar. Miss Jane Marple sat slightly apart, her knitting needles flashing with delicate persistence, as though the wool itself conspired with her to keep her half hidden from the bustle. To the casual observer, she might have seemed absorbed only in her stitches, yet her pale blue eyes rested on everything. The way Mrs. Bantry leaned in too close when speaking with Colonel Melchett, the nervous tapping of young Molly Horton's shoe against the grass as she served cakes, the strained politeness in Mr. Leonard Shaw's laughter. She noticed, too, a window, an upper sash belonging to the old rectory across the lane, that hung stubbornly ajar despite the blustery wind that tugged at the curtains. The matter of a window would hardly be worth remarking in most places, but Miss Marple, who had made something of a lifetime study of how the smallest irregularities of domestic life tended to point to larger disturbances beneath, felt a slight tightening in her chest. The rectory had been shut for months, its former tenant having died in the spring. It was, by all reports, empty. An empty house, however, had no reason to breathe like a living thing through an open window. The fete continued with its usual rhythm. Prizes were awarded for jams and chrysanthemums, raffles were drawn, and Major Harper gave a pompous little speech on the virtues of village unity. The laughter was genuine enough, though Miss Marple could hear in its cadence the faint strains of rivalry and the undercurrent of private concerns. Mrs. Bantry's eternal worry about her husband's flirtations, young Molly's ambitions to leave the village, and Dr. Haydock's secret irritation with the vicar's moralizing. Ordinary human concerns, all of them. Then came the scream. It was sudden, slicing through the afternoon chatter like a knife into cloth. Heads turned at once towards the rectory, where the offending window rattled against the frame. From that direction, Molly Horton stumbled into the garden, her face white as chalk, her hands clutching her apron. There's someone," she stammered, her words tumbling over each other. "Upstairs! Oh, I swear I saw—" The vicar hurried to her side, followed by a crowd of curious villagers, their curiosity only thinly veiled as concern. Miss Marple remained seated a moment longer, her needles poised mid-air, before folding her knitting carefully into her bag. She rose, her step unhurried, and moved quietly with the others towards the rectory. Inside, the air was cold and stale, carrying the faint smell of dust and disuse. The villagers crowded in the hallway, some muttering about tramps or boys up to mischief, while others whispered of burglars. Colonel Melchett barked at them to keep order, though his own moustache twitched with agitation. Molly, trembling, insisted she had seen a figure at the top window. They mounted the stairs cautiously. Miss Marple, at the rear of the group, watched with mild interest as they surged ahead, their bravado fueled more by collective presence than by genuine courage. At the landing, they found the window still stubbornly ajar, the curtain pulled across as though to conceal. It was Mrs. Bantry who gave a sudden gasp. On the floor beneath the window lay a man. His head was twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes staring glassily at the ceiling. One hand clutched the edge of the curtain as if in a last desperate gesture. The broken sash above rattled in the wind, refusing to close. A hush fell, broken only by Molly's choked sob and the vicar's murmured prayer. Colonel Melchett bent down, examined the body with a soldier's bluntness, and pronounced, "Neck broken. Poor devil must have fallen, though from where God only knows. I don't like the look of it." Miss Marple stood very still, her face composed, her eyes soft yet intent. Others were quick to supply theories: an intruder, a suicide, perhaps even a drunken wanderer. Yet she, who knew well the ways of village life, thought only of the curious insistence of that window. Windows, after all, did not refuse to close of their own accord. Someone had left it thus, and that someone had watched. As the crowd muttered and dispersed, Miss Marple leaned slightly against the banister, as though needing its support, though in truth she merely wished to remain unobserved. Her eyes rested upon a faint scuff upon the polished wood, just at the height where a shoe might have slipped in haste. She tucked this little observation away with the rest, secure in her knowledge that in villages, just as in drawing rooms or cottages, the truth always found its way to the surface, though seldom without a struggle. The fête would not be remembered for chrysanthemums this year. It would be remembered for the window that refused to close, and for the stranger who lay dead beneath it. The villagers crowded the stair, pressing forward and falling back in little waves. Colonel Melchett, discovering that people liked to be told what to do, sent the vicar for Dr. Haydock and dispatched Major Harper to telephone the police. The Women's Institute spirited Molly Horton into the study and gave her tea she could not swallow. Miss Marple, content in the shadow of a tall clock, watched without seeming to. The dead man was not known. He was middle-aged, clean-shaven, fairish, his clothes careful without being new. One shoe showed a thin scuff at the toe, neatly placed for a hurried slip on the polished banister. A faint, floury dust lay on the right sleeve of his brown tweed. His hand still pinched the curtain, as if he had meant to steady it or himself. Above, the window rattled, and would not shut for 2 earnest constables. Wood may be contrary, Miss Marple reflected, but it seldom becomes so on its own. Dr. Haydock arrived with his brisk bag and kneeling manner. He examined, rose, and spoke as one used to late arrivals. Neck broken, instant, or nearly. Not a fall from a height, a twist, and a strong one. He did not do it himself. The little hall grew still. Colonel Melchett's moustache bristled as if to attention. "Then we have murder," he said, and the word settled like dust. The police soon spread through the house, and the crowd drifted back to the fete, where solemn faces spoke very quickly. Theories were served with scones. Tramps were popular. Jealousy took a second prize. Mrs. Price Ridley remembered, more clearly with each telling, that she had seen the very man in the High Street yesterday. Miss Marple accepted no theory and missed no crumb. She returned to her table, though her knitting stayed folded, and listened to St. Mary Mead hum like a hive. Molly sat rigid, eyes lowered. Young Tom Reeves hovered at the fringe of any group that contained her, eager, uncertain, and full of unused bravery. Mrs. Bantry moved about with bustling kindness and a guilty sparkle. Major Harper came back with news. No identification, empty pockets save a handkerchief and a raffle stub. Our tickets. A ripple ran through the women around the cornflower blue book. The numbers lay in trim columns. Each stub had a twin somewhere in the village. Under gentle prodding, Molly told what she had seen. "The window was banging," she said. "I went in to shut it before the rain. It stuck, as if someone forced it up too far and the sash weight jammed. Then I heard a step behind me. I turned, the curtain blew, and I could not tell if it was a man or a woman. Then I saw him on the floor." "You are sure of the step?" asked Colonel Melchett. "Yes. It was not mine." Dr. Haydock glanced at Miss Marple. She smiled at the carpet. "Old houses have more steps than feet," she murmured. Mrs. Partridge's pantry walked a week because a spoon wedged its window. Still, spoons are seldom violent. Later, the raffle resumed with the embarrassed air of a concert after a snapped string, a ham, a length of chintz, a tin of biscuits. Subdued applause. The top prize, a silver-framed mirror from Mrs. Bantry, went to number 417. After a small pause, Mr. Leonard Shaw claimed it with an expansive bow that did not reach his eyes. Miss Marple, apprised by a whisper, remembered that the constable had taken from the dead man a stub numbered 416. Proximity, she reflected, is not kinship, only opportunity's next-door neighbour. Evening cooled the green. The rectory was sealed, the body removed. The obstinate window was finally wedged into a sulky compromise with the frame. People went home to suppers and sentences that began with, "Of course I always said." Miss Marple walked by the longer lane, reaching the bakery as the last loaves were drawn. Warm scent spilled into the dusk. Flour travels far, she thought. It clings to sleeves and lingers in curtains. She paused before the darkened shops. In small places, a simple sentiment, injured pride or fear of being laughed at, can swell until it needs more room than a person has. Then, lacking room, it breaks something. At her gate, she met Mrs. Bantry, bright with speculation. "My dear Jane, it is too frightful, and a little glorious, which is wicked. Do you think he was a blackmailer?" Miss Marple's smile was small and not unkind. "He may have been almost anything," she said. "For tonight, let him be what we know, a man who bought a ticket. Tomorrow will make him something else." She went in, set the kettle, and laid out her knitting without touching it. From the lane came a cart's slow rattle and faintly, laughter that stopped short. Miss Marple stood at the window and thought of the ticket book, of 416 and 417 like neighbours who do not speak, of a stuck sash, and of a sleeve dusted where sleeves are brushed by work. In the morning, she decided, names would begin attaching to facts. Morning came heavy with rain clouds that sagged low over St. Mary Mead, dampening the hedgerows and scattering the children who had lingered in hopes of gleaning leftover buns from the fete. Yet inside cottages and shops, the air was brisk with excitement, and the talk of the village carried as swiftly as the wind outside. Who was the man in the rectory, and how had he come to such a fate? Already stories had thickened. Some said he was a stranger from London, others that he had been seen buying cigarettes at the post office, though Mrs. Fowler was certain she had never sold him a thing. At the vicarage breakfast table, Leonard Clement listened distractedly to his wife Griselda's stream of comments. She found it thrilling, in a guilty way, to be living in the midst of a genuine murder mystery. Leonard, however, felt the weight of moral responsibility pressing on his shoulders, particularly since the body had been discovered on ground so near to his own. He had already taken tea with Colonel Melchett that morning and received the expected assurances. The police would canvass, they would trace the raffle ticket, they would identify the dead man by nightfall. But Leonard suspected, he had known Miss Marple too long, that the matter would not be so simple. Miss Marple herself was bent over her geraniums when Inspector Craddock came calling. He had long learned the courtesy of consulting her, though he never admitted to colleagues how much he relied on her observations. She welcomed him with her customary gentle civility, poured him tea that was just a little too strong, and listened with patient eyes. "We've had men in every shop," he reported. "No one recognizes him. The raffle ticket is of interest, of course, number 416, but no one can recall who bought it. Miss Horton insists she did not sell it to him directly, and the pockets, as I mentioned, were empty of papers. No wallet, no letters. Things so seldom disappear by chance," Miss Marple said softly, stirring her tea with an absent air. "And yet sometimes people remove them only to avoid embarrassment rather than guilt. A gentleman who loses his employment may hide his dismissal as keenly as a thief hides his spoils." Craddock frowned. "You think he was known here?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the rain-streaked window. "I think the rectory window was forced up by someone determined, Inspector. Such determination suggests not mischief but necessity. He had to be there. And as for recognition, oh, faces change a good deal with time and disappointment. People who believe they are forgotten often return to places they remember. While this conversation unfolded in the neat sitting room of Miss Marple's cottage, elsewhere the villagers whispered over shop counters and at garden gates. Mrs. Bantry hinted broadly that blackmail was involved, her tone betraying not horror but relish. Dr. Haydock muttered about the strength required to break a man's neck, dismissing the notion of a passing tramp. Molly Horton, meanwhile, grew more pale with each telling of her story, her insistence that she had heard a step behind her sounding rehearsed rather than spontaneous. By midday, the rain had eased, and Miss Marple decided on a quiet walk to the baker's. She moved slowly, stopping at hedges to examine a blossom or to remark on the health of a neighbour's roses, but her mind ticked along briskly. She paused before the bakery door where yesterday she had noticed the scent of flour. Inside, young Tom Reeves was at the counter, fetching his mother's bread. He started slightly at seeing Miss Marple, and she noted the faint dusting of flour across his jacket sleeve. Nothing unusual in a boy leaning against the counter, yet her eyes rested on it a moment longer than courtesy demanded. As she accepted her loaf, she asked, in her mildest tone, "How busy you must be, Tom, with the harvest and all." He flushed. "Yes, ma'am, busy enough." His answer came too quickly, too eager to close the subject. Miss Marple nodded, her smile kind, as if she had asked only out of idle politeness. That evening, Colonel Melchett convened a small gathering in the vicar's study to discuss developments. The identity of the dead man remained elusive. No one in the village claimed him, yet the raffle ticket linked him unmistakably to the fate. Theories were produced, examined, and discarded. Griselda suggested a jealous lover, Dr. Haydock a quarrel over money, Major Harper the hand of foreign agents. All spoke with more conviction than evidence. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting, said very little. Only once did she remark, "It is curious, is it not, that the ticket should be consecutive with Mr. Shaw's? Consecutive numbers so often indicate purchase together. One wonders who was with whom, and why one ticket should end in a mirror, while the other ends in death." Her words left a small silence behind them, into which the crackle of the fire sounded louder. Colonel Melchett harumphed, clearly uneasy, but said nothing further. When the meeting broke, Miss Marple lingered by the hall table, her hand gently brushing the hat rack. On the polished wood was the faintest trace of damp soil, as if someone had leaned there in haste after walking through rain. It was a small thing, easily dismissed, yet Miss Marple stored it away with the scuffed shoe, the flour-dusted sleeve, the obstinate window, and the curious neighbourliness of tickets 416 and 417. Pieces of a pattern, half concealed, like the underside of her knitting. Outside, the night pressed close about the cottages. Lamps flickered, curtains drew shut, and St. Mary Mead tried to compose itself into normality. But Miss Marple knew in her bones, that the village was holding its breath, and that beneath the quiet surfaces lay a tangle of secrets waiting, with inexorable patience, to be drawn out into the light. Morning broke with a pale sun straining through mist, softening the outlines of cottages and hedges, until the village looked half-dreamed. Yet the talk was sharp and awake, for the body in the rectory had unsettled every tongue. The constables had gone door to door, asking names, alibis, and recollections, though in a place like St. Mary Mead, recollection was always coloured by pride or prejudice. Mrs. Price Ridley declared she had seen the dead man buying tobacco on Friday, though her neighbour swore he had been absent all day. Mrs. Bantry insisted on recalling his expression as furtive, though what she had truly seen was no more than the back of a stranger's head. And through all this chatter, Miss Marple moved like a patient gardener among weeds, teasing out the true growth from the rank. Inspector Craddock called again at the vicarage, his expression harried. "We have a London man coming down to see if he can put a name to our fellow," he told Leonard Clement. "Fingerprints will be taken, though I doubt they'll help much unless he's been in trouble before. And as for the ticket, we traced it to the very book Molly Horton used to sell at the fete. Past that, no one seems to recall who bought which. She says she never saw the man at her table." Griselda, who was present, raised an eyebrow. Molly forgets faces too quickly for my taste. I should think one would remember, handing out a ticket to a stranger who later died in one's company. Craddock shook his head. She's frightened, that's all. The girl's near in tears whenever we press her. Miss Marple, who had been quietly winding her wool, said in her gentle, faraway tone, "Tears can come from more than fear, Inspector. Sometimes they come from knowing something one wishes very much not to tell." Her remark was absorbed into silence, but later that morning she walked to the cottage where Molly lived with her widowed mother. Mrs. Horton was a brisk woman of firm opinions and little tolerance for weakness. She received Miss Marple with a flutter of disapproval. "My Molly has been half ill since that dreadful sight," she declared. The police ask the same question 10 times over. What good does it do? My girl is innocent, and she'll not have her name dragged about like some chorus girl in a scandal sheet. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It is very hard for the young," she murmured. "So easily misunderstood. People forget that girls notice things older folk pass by. A step on a stair, for instance, or a shadow across a curtain. I wonder if Molly might take comfort in telling me what she truly saw, without policemen about to make it sound so dreadful." Molly, pale as milk, and with eyes too large in her face, sat rigid in a chair by the fire. At last, in a whisper, she confessed, "I did see someone, Miss Marple, just for a moment before the curtain blew. It was a man, but not the one on the floor. I'm not certain. I think it was Mr. Shaw." Her mother clucked in outrage, but Miss Marple's eyes rested gently on the girl. "You mustn't torment yourself over certainty, dear. A moment can play tricks, but it is well to keep such thoughts safe until they are needed. Thank you for trusting me." That afternoon, as if summoned by Molly's frightened words, Mr. Leonard Shaw himself appeared in the High Street, impeccably turned out in his dark suit, the silver-framed mirror under his arm like a trophy. He stopped to chat with Mrs. Bantry, his charm flowing as smoothly as cream. Yet Miss Marple, who passed by at that moment, saw how his gaze darted once, only once, towards the Hortons' cottage with something very far from idle interest. Colonel Melchett held a meeting at the inn that evening. He spoke of strangers, of tramps on the roads, of undesirable elements who might have slipped into the fete for mischief. Major Harper supported him with bluster, while Dr. Haydock muttered about the folly of ignoring physical evidence. But Miss Marple, quietly knitting in the corner, noted how Mr. Shaw sat with folded hands, smiling faintly, never volunteering an opinion. A man too smooth, she thought, was often smoothing away something better left rough. As the meeting broke up, Miss Marple lingered outside. The night was damp, the air full of wood smoke and the scent of wet earth. She watched Mr. Shaw cross the street, the mirror wrapped now in brown paper. He passed beneath a lamp, and for an instant the paper slipped, revealing not only the glass, but a streak of fine white powder across its edge, like flour or dust shaken from a sleeve. Back in her own cottage, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and looked steadily into the fire. Pieces of the puzzle arranged themselves with the quiet logic of embroidery stitches. The consecutive raffle tickets, the obstinate window, the scuff on the banister, the flower on a sleeve, and Molly's whispered vision of Mr. Shaw. They did not yet form the picture entire, but she sensed the pattern beginning. She knew also, with that instinct born of long observation, that the dead man had not been a stranger by chance. He had been drawn to St. Mary Mead as surely as a moth to lamplight, and someone here had reason enough to wish him silenced forever. Outside, the village lay hushed, each house holding its secrets close. Miss Marple, alone with her thoughts, heard the faint creak of a gate and the hurried step of someone passing by her garden. She did not rise to look, but she smiled faintly. In small places, people reveal themselves most when they believe no one is watching. And Miss Marple, more than anyone, always was. The following morning broke clear and sharp after the long night of mist. St. Mary Mead seemed almost to have washed itself clean, though in truth, the village carried unease beneath its tidy appearance. People went about their routines, bread delivered, children walked to school, hens fed in back gardens, but each conversation, no matter how it began, curved back inevitably to the body in the rectory. Rumour spread like ivy, each tendril clinging to a wall of half-truths. Mrs. Price Ridley now swore she had lent the man a shilling once, though none believed her, while Mr. Cartwright, the grocer, insisted he had seen him loitering near the railway. Yet no one could produce more than memory dressed as invention. Inspector Craddock arrived by motorcar with a London sergeant, a stout man with ink-stained fingers who examined the raffle ticket stubs, the book from Molly's table, and a small collection of items taken from the body. Nothing new was revealed. The man had been careful, or else carefully stripped of what might identify him. Only the stub, number 416, stood as his voice among them, and even that seemed too silent to be of use. Craddock frowned as he explained this to Colonel Melchett at the vicarage. "Someone knew what he carried," he said, "and someone wanted it gone. That isn't the work of accident." Miss Marple was present, her knitting folded but untouched on her lap. She observed quietly while the men spoke, her gaze as gentle as ever. When Craddock at last asked her if she had noticed anything, she replied with apparent hesitation. Only that Mr. Shaw seemed rather reluctant to hold his mirror in public yesterday. A curious reluctance, for a prize is generally displayed with some pride. And then, of course, it had that faint dusting upon the edge. Melchett snorted. "Dust! Half the village is powdered with flour this week, what with harvest and baking." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Flour travels so very far. One seldom knows where it will rest." That afternoon, Miss Marple chose a slow walk past the bakery once more. Tom Reeves stood outside, sleeves rolled up, brushing flour from his clothes. He greeted her with polite awkwardness, and she spoke of gardens and weather, the topics that drew no suspicion. But she noticed, when she mentioned Mr. Shaw, that Tom's hand twitched upon the sack he carried, spilling a little more flour onto the step. A small reaction, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple never overlooked small reactions. Later, at the inn, Inspector Craddock gathered a few of the villagers for further questioning. Mrs. Bantry, eager for drama, spoke at length about the stranger's shoes, certain they bespoke London make. Dr. Haydock insisted the manner of death pointed to strong hands, a sudden twist, nothing an ordinary quarrel would explain. And Molly, still pale, repeated her claim that she had heard a step behind her just before discovering the body. Each word she spoke trembled, as though she feared contradicting herself. Mr. Shaw, when asked to give his account, smiled with easy courtesy. "I had left the fete a little early, you know," he explained. "The press of people rather tired me. I collected my prize and went straight home. I can scarcely imagine how I could be entangled in this poor man's misfortune." His tone was smooth, his manner immaculate, yet Miss Marple noticed how his gaze avoided Molly's entirely, as though to prevent the faintest flicker of recognition. That evening, the vicar returned home to find Miss Marple waiting in his study. She had come, she said, for a quiet word. "I have been thinking of tickets," she told him, her eyes bright under their mild lids. "Consecutive tickets, 416 and 417. They suggest two purchases, one following directly after the other. Now, Mr. Shaw held 417. Who, then, truly held 416? If it were the dead man, he must have been beside Mr. Shaw at the moment of purchase. That places them together, does it not? It may not mean intimacy, but it certainly means proximity." The vicar, though fond of reasoned sermons, felt outpaced. "You mean they might have come to the fete together?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps one followed the other, by design or accident. But it links them, however faintly, and when one man ends with a mirror and the other with a broken neck, I cannot help but wonder what reflection was too dangerous to bear." The vicar shivered, though the fire burned warmly. Miss Marple rose with her usual grace, murmured that she must not overstay, and left him with his thoughts. That night, While the village grew quiet under a waxing moon, Miss Marple sat at her window, the lamplight soft upon her knitting. Her fingers moved automatically, her mind turning not upon wool, but upon people. She thought of Molly's frightened glance, Tom Reeves's twitching hand, Mr. Shaw's avoidance, and the window that had refused to close. A window forced open is seldom random, just as a ticket number is seldom meaningless. The truth, she felt certain, was creeping nearer, like a shadow lengthening across a garden path. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone else knew it too. Someone who would be watching carefully, wondering if the quiet old lady with her knitting needles might see more than anyone else dared to. The next day dawned with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the village itself were holding back its breath. The shops opened, the post arrived, and yet beneath the rhythm of ordinary life ran an undercurrent of strain. People walked a little faster along the lanes, eyes flicking towards the rectory before darting away again. Rumour had hardened into a kind of certainty. The dead man had been no innocent passer-by, but someone with a purpose in St. Mary Mead. What that purpose had been, no one could agree. Inspector Craddock had set his men to making inquiries in nearby towns, hoping for a name, a workplace, some connection that would bring the faceless stranger into focus. But by afternoon, he had nothing to report. "We may have to wait on London," he admitted grimly to Colonel Melchett. "Fingerprints, photographs circulated, all the tedious business. Meanwhile, we're left chasing whispers." Miss Marple, who was present, regarded him kindly. "Whispers are seldom without origin, Inspector. People do not invent what has no seed at all. It may be that the village, in its roundabout way, has already told you more than you realise." Craddock, accustomed now to her oblique hints, sighed. "And you think the seed lies here, among them?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that it is always unwise to assume the centre of trouble lies elsewhere." That evening, a small commotion stirred outside the bakery. Tom Reeves, red-faced and awkward, had quarrelled with another boy who accused him of knowing more about the stranger than he admitted. The scuffle was broken up quickly, but Miss Marple, passing by, noted the flare of panic in Tom's expression. She stopped to pat his arm with grandmotherly reassurance. "Quarrels begin so easily when tempers are uncertain," she said. "I remember when my nephew was your age. He could never keep a secret without it showing in his eyes. People who carry secrets often look as though they are about to run away, don't they?" Tom muttered something inaudible and hurried off, his sack of flour thudding against his side. Later, at the vicarage, Mrs. Bantry arrived in a state of high excitement. She had, she said, remembered something of importance. She had seen Mr. Shaw speaking to the stranger on the morning of the fete. She was certain, of it now, quite certain, though when pressed for details, she grew vague about where and when. "But I know I saw them together," she insisted. "And Mr. Shaw pretended not to notice me, which is very unlike him." Colonel Melchett dismissed her recollection as unreliable. Mrs. Bantry, after all, had a taste for embellishment. Yet Miss Marple considered it carefully. If Mrs. Bantry were correct, it explained the consecutive tickets. If she were wrong, it still told something of value, that the village already half believed in a connection, whether proven or not, and such belief could prove dangerous to anyone attempting to keep their part hidden. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the click of her needles marking the pace of her thoughts. She recalled the flour on Mr. Shaw's prize, the scuff upon the rectory banister, the soil upon the hat rack, Molly's terrified whisper. These things did not yet align in an obvious pattern, but she could sense the edges of it forming. And she knew, with the certainty of long experience, that the killer's greatest fear was not the constables or the official inquiries, but the gradual tightening of the village's watchful net. In a small place, guilt had so few places to hide. The following day brought an unexpected twist. News came from London. The fingerprints of the dead man matched those of a clerk dismissed from a firm in the city. His name was Arthur Bellamy. He had no known family nearby, no police record, and nothing in his past that suggested danger. Yet he had left his employment under a cloud of suspicion concerning missing funds. The sum was modest, but his dismissal had been quiet and final. Inspector Craddock relayed this to Miss Marple with satisfaction. There we are, at least a name, a man dismissed for dishonesty. He might well have been blackmailing someone here, or hoping to. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, but blackmail requires knowledge, Inspector, and knowledge requires intimacy. A London clerk does not choose St. Mary Mead without reason. He must have known someone here, perhaps long ago. One cannot blackmail strangers. The inspector frowned. And who here would be connected to him? Miss Marple looked into the fire, her needles momentarily still. That, Inspector, is the question that matters. Not who he was in London, but who he was before London. We must look not outward, but backward. As if to echo her words, Mrs. Bantry appeared again the next morning with fresh fuel for speculation. She had spoken to old Mr. Simmons, who remembered a Bellamy family in the district years ago, though he could not be sure if it was the same. Names, in villages, have a way of lingering even when their bearers do not. By evening, the village was alive with a new certainty. The dead man had once belonged here. Every household contributed some recollection, each contradictory, yet fiercely believed. And Miss Marple, listening quietly, felt a small knot of clarity tighten. For if Arthur Bellamy had indeed grown up among them, then his return had not been accidental. He had come for someone, and someone had made certain he would not leave again. The shadows lengthened across her little parlour. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and folded her hands. The game had shifted. It was no longer about a nameless stranger, but about a man who had roots in the very soil of St. Mary Mead. And that, she knew, would make the truth both harder to face and impossible to escape. The revelation of Arthur Bellamy's name did not still the village, but rather quickened its pulse. For every recollection that floated to the surface, two more arose in contradiction. Old Mr. Simmons insisted Arthur had been a farmer's son, while Mrs. Fowler claimed he was the nephew of a seamstress who once lived above the haberdashery. Mrs. Price Ridley announced she had always thought the boy sly, though no one could recall her having spoken his name before. Gossip thickened like fog, obscuring more than it revealed. Yet beneath the chatter, Miss Marple felt the shape of something more precise, an undercurrent of knowledge withheld, of memories too exact to be spoken aloud. Inspector Craddock pressed on with steady diligence, interviewing shopkeepers and labourers, cross-checking accounts from decades past, though he admitted to Colonel Melchett that the threads frayed in his hands. If Bellamy had kin here, he said, they've either moved or mean to keep silent. And Shaw is too composed for my liking. Every time we question him, he glides out of reach. Miss Marple, who had been present, allowed herself a small, almost apologetic smile. Men who glide, Inspector, often leave the faintest ripples behind them. If one watches the water, one may see what they hoped to hide. That afternoon, she took a deliberate stroll to the high street. Passing the bakery, she saw Tom Reeves inside, lifting sacks of flour with clumsy eagerness. His mother scolded him for spilling, but his expression was taut, his eyes darting. Miss Marple paused at the window, feigning difficulty with her umbrella. She saw him glance over his shoulder at Mr. Shaw, who happened to be crossing the street at that moment. The look was not friendly. It was not even neutral. It carried the tight fear of one who knows too much. Later, in her own garden, Miss Marple reflected upon the look. Tom had no reason to fear Mr. Shaw unless he connected him with Bellamy. Perhaps the boy had seen something on the day of the fete, some hurried word or gesture exchanged. Youth often notices such things without realizing their value. She resolved to speak to him gently when opportunity allowed, before fear hardened into silence. Evening brought an official gathering at the vicarage, where Craddock attempted to anchor the swirling rumours with fact. He confirmed that Arthur Bellamy had once lived in the district, his family moving away when he was still a boy. Records showed his father had been in trade, respectable but modest, and that nothing at the time had suggested scandal. Yet something drew him back here, Craddock said. Something, or someone. Griselda Clement, listening with interest, asked if perhaps Bellamy had returned to settle an old debt. Colonel Melchett growled that more likely it was to stir up trouble. But Miss Marple, quiet in her chair, murmured, "Debts come in many forms, my dear. Some are measured not in pounds, but in pride. And pride, I fear, is a coin that spends dearly." Her words lingered uneasily in the room. Mr. Shaw, who had been invited as one of the more respectable villagers, shifted almost imperceptibly in his seat. He said nothing, but his eyes flicked once towards Molly Horton, who had been compelled to attend by her mother. Molly sat pale and silent, her hands clenched in her lap, as though she longed to vanish. Miss Marple's sharp gaze, though softened by age, missed nothing. When the meeting ended, she walked slowly home beneath the stars, her stick tapping gently on the pavement. At the corner near the rectory, she paused, looking up at the now secured window. She considered how obstinately it had resisted being closed, how oddly symbolic that seemed. Secrets resisted closure too, and the village was full of them. As she lingered, she heard footsteps. Tom Reeves emerged from the shadow, startled to see her. He muttered an awkward greeting, shifting the weight of a parcel beneath his arm. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Out late, Tom. One must be careful in these unsettled times." He flushed and mumbled that he was only delivering flour to a neighbour. Yet Miss Marple noticed the parcel was too small for flour, wrapped instead in paper such as one might use for books or ledgers. She said nothing, but her mind quickened. A boy with a guilty air, carrying something too carefully for an errand, on a night when the village whispered about a man dismissed for dishonest accounts. It was all too suggestive. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple laid her knitting aside unfinished. She sat very still, piecing together the day's impressions. The scuff upon the banister, the soil on the hat rack, the flour upon sleeves, the mirror Shaw had guarded, Molly's frightened confession, and now Tom's secretive parcel. The pattern was not yet complete, but she sensed it forming with the inevitability of embroidery stitches following a design. She knew one thing with certainty. Bellamy's death was not the work of sudden quarrel or chance misstep. It was deliberate, executed by hands that had reason enough to silence him. And the village, though outwardly calm, was tightening like a noose around that secret. Miss Marple rose at last, drawing her curtains. She felt the presence of watchers, though none could be seen. Someone, she was certain, had noticed her questions, her pauses, her little remarks. Someone was wondering just how much the old lady in the pink shawl had already guessed. And as she prepared for bed, she reflected that in St. Mary Mead it was never the loudest who held the truth, but the quietest. It was in the silence, in the faint twitch of a hand, in the nervous glance across a street, that the story revealed itself. And in silence too, a murderer often betrayed himself, long before he was ready to speak. The morning after her late encounter with Tom Reeves, Miss Marple rose earlier than usual. She sat by her window with her knitting, but her eyes were not on the wool. They rested instead on the lane below, where villagers passed with baskets and parcels, their conversations hurried, their gazes shifting. News of Arthur Bellamy's identity had stirred the quiet into a restless hum, and Miss Marple knew that hum well. It was the sound of secrets straining against their keepers. Inspector Craddock arrived mid-morning to give a formal update at the vicarage. He spoke with the air of a man chasing after shadows. The London sergeant had confirmed that Arthur Bellamy had been under suspicion for embezzling funds at his firm, though not enough to warrant prosecution. A slippery character, Craddock said grimly. Perhaps he thought to make a fresh start here, or perhaps he meant to dig up old dirt. Either way, someone in this village knew him well enough to fear him. Miss Marple, sitting by the hearth, listened in her usual mild silence. Only when the others had spoken their theories, blackmail, revenge, or perhaps even a lover's quarrel, did she stir. "It is curious," she said softly, "how often people return to the places where they once belonged. Like migrating birds, I suppose. They carry with them not only their present troubles, but also the past they never quite escaped. Arthur Bellamy must have believed something here was worth the risk of coming back." Colonel Melchett harumphed impatiently. "We must focus on facts, Miss Marple. This is no time for musings about birds." But Miss Marple's musings were facts of their own kind, though few recognized it. She thought of Tom Reeves, flushed and awkward, his parcel wrapped too carefully. She thought of Molly Horton, pale and frightened, insisting she had seen a figure near the window. And she thought most of all of Mr. Shaw, gliding through the village with his polished charm, never allowing a single word to catch hold of him. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Mrs. Bantry under the pretext of bringing a cutting from her geranium. Mrs. Bantry, as expected, was in a state of high drama, delighted to have a murder at such close range. "My dear Jane, everyone says it must have been blackmail," she declared, bustling about the drawing room. "Bellamy must have known something. About Shaw, perhaps. There's something just a little too smooth about him, don't you think? Why? When I saw him at the fete, he pretended not to notice me. I call that guilty." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Pretending not to. Notice can mean many things, Dolly. Sometimes it is simply the effort not to reveal recognition too soon." The remark silenced Mrs. Bantry for a moment, though she soon recovered enough to launch into speculation about foreign agents, lovers' trysts, and coded messages hidden in raffle tickets. Miss Marple listened politely, but her mind was elsewhere. Recognition. That was the heart of it. Someone had recognized Arthur Bellamy. Someone had known exactly who he was and what he carried with him. And that knowledge had proved fatal. The following day, Inspector Craddock came again, more troubled than before. "There's something odd about Shaw," he admitted at last. "No record of his family in London. He claims to have lived abroad for years, yet nothing checks out. He's a ghost, if you like, solid enough here, but nowhere else." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Ghosts do so often appear when one looks for them, Inspector. But ghosts are seldom strangers. They are old acquaintances we have forgotten until they reappear in different clothes." That evening, as twilight fell, Miss Marple deliberately walked past Shaw's cottage. The curtains were drawn, but a faint light glowed behind them. She paused by the gate, adjusting her shawl, listening. Voices drifted through the window, Shaw's low and measured, another higher, urgent. She thought she recognized Tom Reeves. The boy's tones carried agitation, fragments of phrases. "He said he'd tell. Not safe. I can't." Shaw's reply came calm and smooth, words indistinct but tone unmistakably soothing, like a man pressing down the lid of a box that bulged at the seams. Miss Marple moved on quietly, her stick tapping against the stones. She did not need to hear every word to know that Tom had entangled himself in Shaw's secret, and that Shaw was binding him tighter with every quiet reassurance. That, she thought, was dangerous. Young people, when frightened, sometimes leapt before they looked, and frightened boys could make rash choices. At home, she considered the pattern now forming more clearly. Bellamy had returned with a past that tied him to the village. Shaw had a history that resisted examination. Tom, the baker's son, had seen or heard something he should not. And Molly, poor child, had glimpsed a figure near the window, but lacked the courage to say more. Each piece fit, but the final picture still wavered like an unfinished embroidery. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her mind turning to the next inevitable step. The murderer had silenced Bellamy once. If he feared exposure still, he might seek to silence again. And if that were so, then the village had not yet seen the end of its tragedy. As she prepared for bed, she thought of the rectory window forced up with such determination. Secrets resisted closing, but in the end, they always came crashing down. The question was whether anyone else must fall with them before the truth was laid bare. The following day began with a sudden stir of alarm that rippled through St. Mary Mead, like the peal of a cracked bell. Tom Reeves had not come home the previous night. His mother, frantic, had roused neighbours at dawn, insisting that something dreadful had happened. At first it was thought the boy had gone off with friends or stayed too long at the mill, but when his cap was discovered in the lane near the rectory, damp from the night's dew, the village grew uneasy. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock had called his men to search the hedgerows and barns, their voices carrying through the mist as they shouted the boy's name. Miss Marple, hearing the commotion, stepped quietly from her cottage and joined the group gathered at the vicarage gate. Molly Horton stood pale and trembling beside her mother, and Mrs. Bantry was already spinning tales of kidnappings and foreign spies. But Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her mind turning back to the hushed voices she had overheard the night before at Shaw's cottage. Tom had been frightened then, and she knew frightened boys sometimes disappeared, not because they were taken, but because they were persuaded. By noon, word spread that Tom had been found, alive, though shaken. He had been discovered in an old cart shed at the edge of the fields, his clothes rumpled, his face white with fatigue. He insisted he had simply fallen asleep there after wandering too long. But Miss Marple saw at once the mark of fear behind his excuses. His eyes would not meet hers, and his hands trembled when offered bread and milk. Inspector Craddock questioned him sternly, but Tom repeated his story without variation. To most it sounded thin, but it was delivered with such doggedness that even Melchett grunted his acceptance. Only Miss Marple, watching from her corner, saw the truth of it, that the boy was hiding something, and that someone had coached him carefully. That evening, Miss Marple visited the Reeves cottage. Mrs. Reeves, grateful for her kindness, bustled about making tea, leaving the two of them alone. Tom sat stiffly, his gaze fixed on the floor. Miss Marple took up her knitting, letting the silence stretch until it grew unbearable for the boy. Then, in her gentle, conversational way, she said, "It is very difficult, isn't it, when one knows something that one is afraid to speak of? My nephew, when he was your age, once kept a secret about a broken window for weeks. It ate at him dreadfully, until at last he blurted it out, and then the punishment was much less than the misery of silence." Tom looked up quickly, colour flooding his face. For a moment he opened his mouth, but then shut it again, glancing nervously towards the door. Miss Marple laid a hand lightly on his arm. "It is quite all right, my dear. You needn't tell me before you are ready. Only remember, those who threaten are always most afraid themselves. You are not alone." The boy's lips trembled as if he were on the verge of confession, but his mother's return stifled it. Miss Marple left soon after, her mind more certain than ever that Tom had seen something he dared not repeat. And she knew, too, that Mr. Shaw's calm voice the night before had been less comfort than constraint. Inspector Craddock, when informed, grew frustrated. "If the boy knows something, why won't he speak? We cannot protect him if he refuses to tell us." Miss Marple, however, counselled patience. "You may find, Inspector, that truth comes out when least expected. Young people often reveal themselves, not when questioned, but when they believe no one is listening." 2 days later, that prediction seemed near fulfillment. At the market, Tom, standing apart from his mother, was overheard by Molly Horton. He had whispered something, too low for others to catch, but Molly repeated later to her friend that he had spoken of a quarrel at the fete near the ticket table. The words flew quickly through the village, adding fuel to speculation. Who had quarrelled with Arthur Bellamy? And why had no one admitted to it? Miss Marple, when she heard this, nodded gravely. A quarrel at the ticket table explained much. The consecutive stubs, the forced window, the scuff on the banister. It suggested a meeting that had not been chance but design, an encounter that ended with violence. That evening she walked again past Shaw's cottage. This time he was outside, trimming his hedge with fastidious care. He greeted her warmly, too warmly, and she responded with her mild smile. Yet she noted the stiffness in his hands, the faint tension in his jaw. He asked after her roses, she praised his hedge, and they parted with every appearance of civility. But Miss Marple walked home certain of one thing, that Leonard Shaw was not a man who trimmed hedges out of calm habit. He trimmed because his nerves required occupation. At her cottage, she set aside her knitting unfinished, the wool trailing across her lap. The pattern was forming at last, sharper than before. Bellamy had returned to St. Mary Mead not merely with dishonour from London, but with knowledge of someone here, someone whose respectability was built upon concealment, that someone had silenced him with ruthless speed and now sought to keep others silent through persuasion and fear. Tom's vanished night, Molly's trembling, the mirror with its dusting of flour, all these threads bound themselves together around the figure of Shaw. But Miss Marple knew better than to leap too soon. A net was most effective when drawn tight at the very last moment. Until then, the fish must believe itself safe. And so she prepared herself, calmly and quietly, for what must come. For she knew that before the truth was revealed, Shaw, or whoever lay at the heart of this, would be compelled to make another move. And when he did, she would be waiting, her needles poised, her eyes kind but unrelenting, ready to draw the threads together into the final design. The village seemed to sink into a taut silence, as if all of St. Mary Mead were listening for something just beyond hearing. The gossip that had once bustled so cheerfully now carried a sharp edge, and though people still whispered in shops and hedgerows, their eyes darted towards their neighbours with quick suspicion. Arthur Bellamy was no longer merely a stranger. He was a ghost risen from the soil of the village itself, and his death pointed too clearly to someone among them. Miss Marple, who had cultivated the art of seeming harmless, knew that suspicion pressed heaviest upon Leonard Shaw. The man bore it well, smiling, nodding, exchanging civilities with the very people who whispered his name behind his back. Yet his eyes betrayed him, too watchful, too cautious, never quite meeting those who spoke. Miss Marple had seen that same guarded look years ago in a young maid who had stolen a brooch and lived in terror of discovery. She knew then that Mr. Shaw, whatever his true name, carried with him a past too fragile to withstand exposure. Inspector Craddock felt the weight of the same instinct, but lacked the certainty. He returned to the vicarage with the latest inquiries. Bellamy's dismissal was over a trifling sum, yet he was desperate enough to threaten someone with what he knew. My men can find no kin still living nearby. He must have come back for a person, not a place. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, looked down at her work as though the wool itself had whispered to her. Yes, Inspector, he came for a person, and the curious thing about people is that they so seldom change in the ways that matter. A thief may become respectable, a child may grow into a gentleman, but the little traits, the way one evades a question or insists too much on civility, those do not vanish. Craddock gave a weary smile. And you believe Shaw fits that bill? She lifted her eyes, mild and serene. I believe he fears being recognised, Inspector. Recognition is far more deadly than suspicion. Suspicion can be denied. Recognition cannot. That afternoon, word spread that Tom Reeves had been seen again near Shaw's cottage. Mrs. Reeves, anxious and indignant, declared her boy innocent of any mischief, but the villagers exchanged meaningful glances. Miss Marple heard it all without comment. She knew Tom was caught in the middle, pulled by fear of Shaw on one side and by the burden of what he had seen on the other. Young consciences, she reflected, often wavered until someone gave them courage. Evening came, and with it a small gathering at the inn, where Colonel Melchett and Craddock pressed the villagers once more. Questions were asked about the fete, about the raffle table, about who had spoken to Bellamy before the window was forced open. Most gave vague replies. Only Molly Horton looked close to breaking. Her eyes filled with tears as she stammered that she had glimpsed Shaw near the rectory. At once her mother hushed her, insisting she was mistaken. But the words had escaped into the air, and once released, they could not be gathered back. Shaw's composure did not falter outwardly, but Miss Marple saw the faint tightening of his hand against the table, the minute pause before he smiled. "The poor girl is overwrought," he said smoothly. "It is quite understandable. Such a shock could unsettle anyone." His voice was velvet, but beneath it Miss Marple heard the iron of command, the tone of a man who had held power over others before. Later, when the meeting ended, Miss Marple lingered outside in the dark. She watched Shaw leave, his step measured, his head inclined politely to those who muttered behind him. But once he turned into the lane, his pace quickened. He looked back once, sharply, and then vanished into the shadows. It was not the walk of an innocent man. That night, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, the fire low, her knitting motionless in her lap. She thought of Arthur Bellamy's lifeless body at the rectory window, of Molly's trembling voice, of Tom's guilty silence, of Shaw's too careful smile. The design was nearly complete. She understood now that Bellamy had returned not as an intruder, but as someone with a claim, a memory, a knowledge that linked him directly to Shaw. The consecutive raffle tickets were no coincidence. They had stood together at that table, bound by a past the village had not yet guessed. And she knew, too, that Shaw would move again. He had already silenced once. He had nearly frightened Tom into silence as well. But fear, Miss Marple reflected, was a dangerous ally. It often slipped its leash. Tom's disappearance, Molly's near confession, the whispers that circled tighter each day. These were pressures even a smooth man could not long withstand. She poured herself a cup of tea and sipped it thoughtfully, her expression serene. Yet her mind was clear and unsparing. It would not be enough to accuse Shaw without proof. Proof, in matters such as these, came not from fingerprints or ledgers, but from human nature itself. A small slip, a careless reaction, a word said too quickly. These were the true evidences of guilt, and Miss Marple knew how to draw them out. When she finally rose and prepared for bed, she felt no weariness. Instead, there was a calm certainty, the same she felt when a puzzle had only one missing piece left to place. Soon she would see it fall into position. Soon the quiet threads she had been weaving would tighten into a net. And when that moment came, Leonard Shaw, or whatever name he bore, would find himself quite undone, not by police strength or official inquiry, but by the watchful eyes of an old lady who had never ceased to notice the little things people thought too small to matter. The following evening, under the pretext of a quiet tea, Miss Marple invited Inspector Craddock, Colonel Melchett, Mrs. Bantry, and Leonard Shaw to her cottage. The room was warm, with lamplight, the little fire crackling gently, the table laid with seed cake and tea, as though nothing more serious than parish gossip were to be discussed. Yet the air carried a weight, for everyone sensed something was about to be said that would not be easily unsaid. Miss Marple, her needles lying neatly in her lap, began in her mildest voice. "I think we may put away the thought of tramps and foreign agents. Arthur Bellamy was no stranger here. He had been a boy in this very village, and like many who leave, he came back, not to the place so much as to a person. He remembered someone, and he believed that someone would remember him." Shaw shifted slightly, his eyes fixed on the teapot. Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational. "At the fete, Bellamy purchased a raffle ticket just before Mr. Shaw. Their numbers were consecutive, 416 and 417. It was not chance. They approached the table together. Molly Horton saw them, though she dared not say it outright. They knew each other. And Bellamy, I think, had some hold on Mr. Shaw. Something from long ago." Colonel Melchett muttered impatiently, but Craddock raised his hand for silence. Miss Marple's voice remained steady, almost regretful. "You see, Arthur Bellamy knew Leonard Shaw's true name. Years ago, before the war, Shaw had been a young man of promise, but there was scandal, money missing, a dismissal. Shaw disappeared, remade himself, and returned under a different name. Arthur Bellamy, dismissed later under similar circumstances, recognized him at once. Perhaps he thought they shared a kindred plight. More likely he saw opportunity. A man who has remade his life so carefully will pay dearly to keep it intact. Shaw's face remained composed, but a faint whiteness had crept around his lips. Miss Marple's gaze rested gently on him. Bellamy sought him out in the rectory. That is why the window was forced open. It was not a thief breaking in, but a man demanding entry to speak with someone he knew inside. There was a quarrel. Bellamy threatened exposure, and Shaw, smooth and determined as always, ended it with his hands. A twist of the neck. Quick, decisive, but too final to be concealed. She paused, her eyes soft, her manner almost apologetic. The flower upon his sleeve gave him away. He brushed against the bakery sacks when leaving in haste. Later, it dusted the edge of the mirror he claimed as a prize. Little things, Mr. Shaw. Small traces that linger when men are careless. I have often thought the smallest clues are the hardest to hide. Craddock leaned forward sharply. Then it was you, Shaw. You killed him. For a moment, Shaw sat utterly still, his fingers pressed against his knee. Then he laughed quietly, though the sound rang hollow. You have no proof, he said. Old women's tales and flower dust. Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. Proof enough lies in Tom Reeves. He heard you that evening. He heard your quarrel, with Bellamy at the fete, and he heard your voice urging him to silence after. You thought to frighten him into obedience, but frightened boys seldom keep silent forever. The silence in the little parlour deepened until Shaw's composure cracked. His hand trembled as he reached for his teacup, and the tremor spoke louder than denial. Colonel Melchett rose, his face stern, while Craddock stood to his full height. Shaw glanced once about him, as if seeking escape, but found none. He sank back into his chair, his polish stripped away, his voice low and bitter. He would have ruined me, he muttered. All these years, all my work, and for what? A petty clerk who could not hold his own. Craddock laid a hand upon his shoulder, firm and final. It is finished, Shaw. The man was led away without struggle, leaving behind only the faint echo of his steps. Mrs. Bantry, shaken yet exhilarated, whispered of how astonishing it all was. Colonel Melchett muttered about human weakness, his voice rough with unease. But Miss Marple merely resumed her knitting, the wool slipping calmly between her fingers. When at last she was left alone, she sat in the quiet and considered the embers glowing in the grate. Murder, she thought, was never born of great passions alone. More often it was a smaller thing, fear of shame, pride too long carried, secrets that grew too heavy to bear. Arthur Bellamy had sought to profit from memory, and Leonard Shaw had sought to bury it. Between them lay a broken neck and a village unsettled. Yet in time, St. Mary Mead would return to its routine, the gardens tended, the shops busy, the gossip brisk as ever. Only the rectory window, rattling faintly in the autumn wind, would whisper the memory of the man who had returned, and the man who could not escape what he was. And Miss Marple, quietly folding her knitting, thought once more of human nature, fragile, proud, and endlessly revealing to those with patience to watch.